Kokomi is rerunning again, so I'm sure many of you are preparing for her. And even if you already have her, maybe you will still find my video helpful. She is one of the most versatile characters you can play in Genshin, and I mean everything from her artifact sets, weapons, and playstyles in teams. If you want to see a complete full guide of her, you can check out my written guide. I'll put the link in the description. It's fully updated, so you can take a look at that. But for this video, instead of doing a full guide, I just want to focus on the teams, since that's the main thing that's been changing with her for the past year. So let's start with Nilou Bloom, which ever since Nilou came out in version 3.1, this has either been Kokomi's most popular playstyle or just below that. If freeze is really effective, that Abyss, then an Ayaka team like this is often number one. Now, hopefully this goes without saying, but you do need Nilou in order to be playing Bloom, since she basically transforms the reaction from something that doesn't really do anything to something very powerful. So let's talk about Nilou and Kokomi's synergy and why they work so well together. So Nilou Bloom teams are limited to just Hydro and Dendro teammates in order to activate Nilou's special talent, which enhances your Bloom reactions. And the overall goal of the team is kind of to generate as much AoE Dendro and AoE Hydro application as possible. To cut a long story short, that maximizes your Bloom reactions. And Kokomi is very effective at achieving this, alongside providing additional tools with her amazing roll compression. Firstly, since the Bountiful Cause deals significant recoil damage to yourself, Kokomi's healing from various sources provides key healing roll compression. If you've played these teams before, you know how critical this is. Without any form of healing or shielding, you basically can't really play these teams and your characters will quickly die. As a catalyst wielder with on-demand elemental, basic attacks, charge attacks, Kokomi is very flexible and you can spend time on field or off field to bring additional Hydro application as you need. And as a bonus, whenever you play her on field using her elemental burst, she will heal your team even faster to help recovery from this recoil damage. Since in these teams you can only play Hydro and Dendro teammates, obviously this limitation prevents Anemo supports, so obviously you lack that crowd control that you normally want in AoE content. Kokomi wielding sacrificial fragments helps mitigate this somewhat. Its passive allows you to easily reposition her jellyfish, so being able to properly reposition it in front of enemies as they're spawning in and out of combat is very helpful for your AoE consistency. And just as an extra bonus synergy, Sacrificial Fragments gives EM for Kokomi's reaction damage. I would say the only real anti-synergy with Nilou is that Kokomi typically stacks HP and healing bonus in her builds. However, since Kokomi typically deals important reaction damage in your teams, since she could be triggering quite a lot of blooms, building EM for her is often key to raising your team's ceiling. Therefore, you could consider Kokomi's bloom builds to be somewhat unnatural, and having to focus on EM can reduce her maximum HP and her healing potential. However, if you watch my previous videos, you'll know that hybrid builds covering all Kokomi stats can be strong and well-rounded too. This can be contrary to popular belief, and Kokomi actually doesn't need to fully stack EM. The reality is, since these teams have lots of EM buffs and reaction bonus buffs, there are a lot of diminishing returns and it can be somewhat overkill compared to building her full kit. Building her hybrid can effectively use 4-piece Ocean Hued Clam to improve her personal damage whilst you still get EM through your weapons, substats and team buffs. And a build like this can be more practical for the average player. However, on the flip side, I would add that even if you fully invest in EM, Kokomi's base healing is still pretty good. Even if you only have like 25k or 27k HP on her, it's still possible to survive and get through an abyss without dying. Although, like I said, for the average player, you don't need to be min-maxing this hard, and you can definitely prefer comfort and still not lose that much overall damage. If you want to know more about this, you can check out my previous video on Ocean Hued Clam and hybrid builds. Here's some soft stat goals that we created before. You can just use these stats as reference points, and depending on which artifact set you use, just use these as guidelines and try to make your builds close to this. Kokomi versus Barbara. So this is a hot debate at the moment. A lot of people want to know how big of an upgrade Kokomi is. Unfortunately, and I don't think this is a cop-out answer, but it really does depend on how you play the game and what you value. Do you care about speed runs and which character can clear the abyss faster? Then Kokomi would either be a small upgrade or a big upgrade depending on the chamber. Or do you care about saving primo gems? So is a few seconds faster damage worth thousands of your primo gems? If you don't care about Kokomi's other teams and you're just looking at Nilou Bloom, then you might not find the upgrade big enough. Also lastly, and a lot of people might not know this, but if you're a dolphin or a whale, then you might not care about either Kokomi or Barbara here. Instead, Baizhu with constellations could be the character you want. So I can elaborate a bit more on Kokomi's strengths versus Barbara and how she can have better DPS. One of the main reasons is due to Kokomi's hydro application flexibility. For example, you take the current Abyss Floor 12 Chamber 1. You can use your normal attacks, charge attacks, jellyfish and your initial burst cast to basically delete the pyroelectric shield faster than Barbara. As I've covered in a previous video, these all have separate hydro application. So you can actually combo these all fairly quickly for very front-loaded and fast hydro application and blooms. Alternatively, in Chamber 2, you could do a thing where you separate Kokomi's jellyfish and position it on one side of the map, and then you go on the other side of the map to attack. This allows Kokomi to combo with Nahida's skill, and it's pretty cool. You can defeat enemies on both sides of the map at the same time. Obviously, other characters will struggle at this. I would also say that Kokomi is able to utilize sacrificial fragments better, since the skill reset is a bigger deal for Kokomi. Being able to reposition her jellyfish solves one of her biggest weaknesses. This also allows a constant stream of hydro particles for the team energy, whereas as we know, Barbara unfortunately isn't able to generate team energy with her skill. So onto teams, and actually this 3-character core of Nilou, Kokomi, Nahida is actually a very complete 3-man core. You got everything from the team buffs, the healing, the AoE hydro application, the AoE dendro application. Players pick the 4th character depending on their goal, depending on which character they prefer, which characters they have available, and you've got quite a lot of options here. Nahida's just that strong, but obviously not everyone has her, so I will get into teams that don't feature Nahida. For what I usually play, personally I play collei a lot, so I would play this team, and then if I'm playing an Abyss that has lots of aggressive enemies, these days I'll use kirara instead, and I also sometimes use yelan, especially if I'm using this Bloom team in the overworld. So this is a team with Traveler and Collei. This was one of the original Bloom teams, and it's very free-to-play friendly. Collei was given for free as a free-to-play character, and Collei was also free. One thing I will say about this team is, obviously since this is a very accessible team, don't expect it to be very consistent. Traveler's burst has a wide range, and together with Collei's own bursting skill, you can be creating quite a lot of blooms whilst those are active. The issue is, you will often find there's just a damage downtime whenever Collei's skill and burst expire. But on the plus side, there's quite a decent amount of team buffs in this team. For example, Traveler has 60 EM for the on-field character with the A1 talent. Collei provides 60 EM to the team with her C4. And you can also give the instructor set to Collei, although this would lower her HP and make her more risky to play. There's even Elegy for the end and Nahida's burst buffs. Together, these will support Nilou's own EM buffs, which will raise your team's damage floor. Now, if you have Nahida, you can be playing this team, which I mentioned before is probably my most favourite team. There are tons of videos on my channel that you could be watching to see some gameplay, but I do want to cut a long story short for this team, which is that it's a very flexible and versatile team that is able to take on multi-wave content or bosses, and you will find this particular team to be one of the most consistent ones for getting Kokomi to do a lot of bloom reactions, and of course this will take advantage of your high EM builds on Kokomi. Since together with Nahida's elemental skill, Collei has such a high amount of danger application, you can actually build her with the emblem set, and she won't be doing that much reaction, so this extra personal damage can add up, although it won't be the highest. But at least you don't need to be worrying too much about her own EM. Although I know some people can still be finding Collei hard to play because she has the animation lockout when you use the elemental skill. So you can replace Collei with someone like Traveler, who although they won't have as much of a damage ceiling as Collei, they can be a lot more comfortable to play. However, you can slot a shielder in this slot instead. For example, using Kirara or Baizhu. As I mentioned earlier, this is something that's very good quality of life in the recent aggressive abysses. There's a lot of enemies that will stagger you a lot and interrupt your teams, and this makes characters like Kirara or Baizhu very nice. Just don't expect them to match up to Collei's danger application and flexibility. I usually build Kirara with sacrificial sword and as much HP as possible. Kirara's shields are created with her skill, and they're easily reapplied throughout encounters due to the skill's fairly short cooldown, which ranges from 8 to 12 seconds depending on how long Kirara spent in her hold skill state. But personally I find you can just tap her skill a lot rather than needing to use her hold skill, so it's just about 8 seconds. In comparison to Baizhu, I would say using Kirara has a different playstyle, which is more similar to a quick swap kind of playstyle. I do recommend swapping between your characters a lot, especially in nahida, to use her skill. This is in order to maintain a steady Dendro core production rate. Kirara also has off-field Dendro application with her burst, and if you have a Constellation 4, she gains off-field Dendro hits, which is very helpful. However, contrary to popular belief, this constellation isn't mandatory, as like I said, it's very viable to just be playing a quick swap sort of playstyle and constantly be switching between teammates, and you can get enough bloom production just doing that. You can also play Baizhu instead of Kirara for shield and healing. Although shielding isn't as good as Kirara's, it won't really tank much, but that's because he has a lot of healing instead. His burst also lasts a long time, so you don't need to worry as much about refreshing his shield. Lastly, you don't actually need to be using a Dendro teammate for your 4th character. You can use a Hydro character instead for triple Hydro. You can say triple Hydro is the alternative playstyle, and the main difference here is instead of spending more time attacking with Kokomi on field, you spend more time attacking with nahida on field. Although this still is quite a quick swap playstyle. This is because as a solo Dendro character, nahida's skill will not be able to self-sustain and reactivate itself without additional sources of Dendro application. So basic attacking with nahida on field is quite crucial for maintaining your team's Dendro core production rate. However, I do want to say, contrary to popular belief, nahida has strong Dendro application, and she definitely is not the sole trigger of reactions in this team. So many of your blooms will still be scaling from your teammates' EM stats, and regardless of whether you use xingqiu or yelan as your 4th character, you will want to build some EM on the entire team. Although nahida spends a lot of time on field, I still recommend switching back to other teammates fairly often in order to recast their skills, for example recasting Yelan's skill. And generally it's a good idea to be doing this right after you cast nahida's skill. This will reduce the downtime in your Dendro core production. One thing you really do need to pay attention to if you're playing triple Hydro is because nahida spends quite a lot of time on field, compared to double Hydro teams with Kokomi on field, nahida does not have that high HP. So since she is sustaining the bulk of your team's recoil damage, you're going to want to build your Kokomi for at least a hybrid build, if not full healer build. Even though Kokomi will be dealing lower bloom damage, you need her to be healing a lot to help with nahida's survival. And as I said before, both Yelan and xingqiu will be creating bloom reactions. This can make building them difficult since you want crit, EM and energy recharge, and it's difficult to have all these stats in your builds. To make this easier, I generally suggest just using their normal builds but giving them an EM weapon like Xiphos, Moonlight or Stringless. This usually is a quick fix to get your hybrid, EM, crit, energy recharge builds without too much effort. A lot of people ask me which artifact set they should be using on Kokomi in Bloom, or which set they should farm for. I have made quite a lot of videos on this, so I do recommend watching those. However, for a TLDR, Hybrid Ocean Huge Clam builds are quite comfortable to play with increased healing, so if you don't care too much about the maximum damage in bloom teams, you can go for that. The artifact set is also a lot more versatile for Kokomi. Obviously in Kokomi's other teams you aren't really using an EM set, so if you want to play other teams like Mono Hydro or Electrocharged, then getting a bunch of Ocean Huge Clam pieces can be resin efficient. Alternatively, I would say if you want the maximum amount of bloom damage and you don't mind farming a bunch of different sets for your Kokomi, I do recommend players grind out some Flower of Paradise Lost pieces, just because that's the only way to get the maximum amount of bloom damage for her. And the other good thing is you can also use Flower of Paradise Lost on other bloom teammates like Nilou or Xingqiu, so farming in that domain can be quite efficient in terms of farming for your bloom team. But obviously at the same time it can be harder to play with lower HP and lower healing, so even then Flower of Paradise Lost Kokomi builds are not for everyone. Personally, I've been playing for a long time, so I have a bunch of these sets and I've farmed all of them. So if you want to be like me, you would farm for both. Obviously, like many other Hydro characters, Kokomi can be played in hyperbloom teams. For Kokomi in particular, these teams aren't the most popular. Whilst hyperbloom teams are a lot more popular without using Kokomi, she still can utilize these teams well, especially because, as I mentioned before, there's been quite a lot of incentives to use Dendro teams, and in particular these hyperbloom teams with 3 different elements are quite good at shield breaking too. Basically, hyperbloom teams are using Kokomi and a Dendro teammate, and then you usually pair them with either a full elemental mastery Kukui Shinobu or a full elemental mastery Raiden. For example, this 3-man core is very popular. It's Nahida, Kukui Shinobu and Xingqiu, and then you just put Kokomi on top. There's also a premium version of this team where you use Yelan and Raiden instead. What Kokomi does well in these teams is that she adds a lot of healing in these teams. She also brings a bit more AoE Hydro application, and you can use her on field quite a lot in these teams too. And then in the premium versions of the team, if you're using Yelan, that means you lose out on Xingqiu's interruption resist and damage reduction, and Kokomi helps mitigate that with her own healing and her own increased resistance to interruption in her burst. I have got example rotations here, but the teams are overall quite flexible. Another good thing about Kokomi is that her jellyfish will activate in the background even if you're not normal attacking. This is very noticeable when you're using burst animations, you're still doing hyperblooms. For example, one tip I would say is using Nahida's burst after you've done your full team setups. For Kokomi's builds in hyperbloom, since obviously she isn't triggering the hyperbloom reactions herself, you can just build her a normal DPS HP build. I just use Ocean Huge Clam and make sure I have enough healing and energy recharge. You can also play Kokomi in Mono Hydro, which is a very fun team to play, and you can use it in a lot of different content as long as you don't need a variety of elements for shield breaking, and it also doesn't have the best AoE. But even though I say Mono Hydro, it's important to know that this isn't just a team built as a gimmick. It's not Kokomi and any 2 Hydro characters. Instead, I would rather say that this team is more like a team that drives the Xingqiu and Yelan core. As you know, that double Hydro core is a very powerful core with a lot of single target damage and just the off-field powerhouse. So you combine them with Kazuha for even more damage buffs to increase the damage even more and provide grouping. And then what Kokomi does is she adds a lot of roll compression in that final slot. First of all, she lowers Xingqiu and Yelan's energy recharge requirements, since obviously she's a Hydro character. This allows them to comfortably use even their strongest 5-star weapons without running into energy issues. She also takes the defensive utility role, as she is obviously a great healer, and she's also a pretty good driver. Together with Kazuha, they both take little field time away from your normal attacks, and this makes this team pretty good at maximizing the amount of Xingqiu and Yelan burst hits that your team can get. In comparison to other teams, there's not that many burst animations, and even Kazuha's burst isn't mandatory in this team. And I would also say another good thing about Kokomi in this team is that this team has quite a lot of good buffs for her, like Kazuha's buffs and an extra HP from Hydro Resonance, and Yelan's own damage buffs, and Xingqiu's Hydro Res debuff from his C2. These are the kind of buffs that are very helpful for Kokomi's personal damage, and in comparison, she doesn't really care about attack buffs like Bennett's Burst. There could be other characters that you would play in this slot that would be losing out if you're not using Bennett or they don't provide healing, whereas Kokomi doesn't care about those, so she fits in here very well. This team is very simple to play. There are rotation examples, but you can do whatever you want. You can even spend less time on Kokomi if you want to be flexible and move about to different enemies in different parts of the map. One tip I would add is that Kazuha doesn't even need to be bursting consistently in this team. Instead, you can redirect his energy recharge stats into just going full into EM and just like building 1000 EM on Kazuha with an Iron Sting or a Freedom Sworn, or whatever you have. This is because Kazuha's burst doesn't really do that much damage, and the long animations will take away time from you spamming normal attacks to trigger Xingqiu and Yelan's burst, which means, like I said, you're often just better off just maximizing his buffs and just maximizing the normal attacks. And overall, I would just say to use his burst if you're fighting in an AoE situation, if there's downtime in your fight, like say a boss is transitioning into another phase, or if your teammates are not well enough invested for Kazuha's burst to be insignificant. I've covered this team in an old video, but this team also scales really well with investment, and it's one of the rare Kokomi teams where things like her signature weapon Moonglow and her Constellation 1 can be fairly valuable. Things like giving Xingqiu Jade Cutter can be a 30% upgrade, giving Yelan Aqua Simulacra can be a 40% upgrade, Kokomi C1 can be 24, which is pretty good, and even Moonglow can be like an 8% upgrade. So if you have Moonglow and you want to utilize it, this could be the team for you. I'm sure, as you know, in other teams like Bloom or when using as a free support, you don't really get to utilize that weapon, so it can feel quite useless, but in Mono Hydro it can be used to its full potential, especially because Kokomi actually has quite a lot of personal damage in this team. This team has about a third split between all the characters. Maybe Yelan slightly higher depending on her investment, or Kokomi slightly higher depending on your animation cancels or if you have a weapon or C1. But like I said, this is quite cool that in this team Kokomi is a significant damage dealer. So if you're a Kokomi main and you want to be using her to deal a lot of damage, this could be the team for you. There's also electrocharged or taser, whatever you want to call it. These teams aren't as popular as they used to be, especially in comparison to hyperbloom teams or mono hydro, but certain variants are still used quite a bit. In these teams, Kokomi is commonly paired with fischl to provide both hydro application for teammates to react with and extremely valuable vol compression, allowing a lot of flexibility for the last two teammates without you having to need to worry about needing a defensive utility character. The cool thing about Kokomi and fischl synergy is that both their elemental skills are off-field deployables, and although fischl C6 does scale with a lot of normal attack spam, she still has good damage and electro application without this, so efficiently spamming normal attacks isn't that crucial. And depending on your teammates, you can play very fluidly without needing to do these normal attack spams. For team examples, there is this triple 4-star team with beidou and sucrose. This is basically, you can say, the classic taser team, but with Kokomi instead of Xingqiu. With obviously the main benefit Kokomi bringing is that she actually brings proper healing and defensive utility. The other good thing is that a lot of the most optimal weapons in this team are free to play accessible weapons. So combining that with the 4-star characters themselves, this can be a very accessible team. The other good thing about replacing Xingqiu with Kokomi is that she can also take on field time. So you can either share field time or you can use either depending on whoever you prefer more. There's also a more premium variation of this team with using Kazuha instead of sucrose. And in fact, his ability to buff the team's elemental damage in comparison to sucrose buffing the team's EM can actually be better for these characters. Since electrocharged damage, especially if it's not coming from a high EM animo character, it's not that important. So as it turns out, buffing their raw damage, like Kokomi's raw hydro and beidou's raw electro damage, ends up being more valuable. Kazuha himself also has good synergy with Kokomi and fischl because, as I said before, Kokomi and fischl skills are deployables. So he can stand on top of the jellyfish and Oz and pull enemies towards them. I think these are pretty fun to play and it can feel very fluid to play, especially in comparison to using sucrose instead. Then there's also a variation where you play miko instead of beidou. And I actually did weapon calcs on this team and it turns out hakushin ring is Kokomi's best weapon in this team. If you are interested, I will put the link to these weapon calcs in the video description. Miko, in comparison to beidou, she adds another off-field deployable, and this makes her synergize even better with Kazuha. To be honest, she also brings better single target damage than beidou. I do have some rotation examples for this team. It's quite flexible and you can just sort of do what you want. One of Kokomi's most popular uses is using her as a free support. I've posted a lot of ayaka gameplay and guides in the past and I often use Kokomi. Just know that if you're not familiar with these teams, they don't quite use Kokomi's kit to its full extent. You can say you only really use her for elemental skill for freeze, you don't really care about her damage, you don't really care about her normal attacks or her burst. But Kokomi and Ayaka have pretty good synergy. Ayaka's elemental burst and her DPS windows, its accuracy, as well as Ayaka's overall kit has high synergy and is fairly reliant on frozen targets, and that's one of the more important reasons why Ayaka seeks a hydro teammate and freeze teams in particular. And Kokomi is perfect for this because she provides long-lasting AoE off-field hydro application with her skill. Whilst I wouldn't say it's perfect, it's as close as you could probably expect for an ideal hydro applicator for Ayaka. Another benefit that Kokomi has is that this elemental skill is very fast to use, and generally she ends up allowing faster setups than other teammates. The only real comparison to this is if you're playing Mona and you only use Mona's elemental skill, but I'll get into Kokomi versus Mona comparisons in a bit. Kokomi's elemental skill also lines up perfectly with Ayaka rotations. Whilst Kokomi doesn't have natural buffs in her kit, she is able to utilize things like TTDS and the artifact set tenacity of the Millilith. These provide a lot of attack to Ayaka, and these are both very accessible because TTDS is a free 3-star and you can use very basic rough tenacity of the Millilith pieces. So overall building for these things is incredibly accessible and has a low investment cost. Overall, I would also say that Kokomi's power budget for these freeze teams, because it cares very little for Kokomi's personal damage, this allows the rest of the freeze team to be focused completely on utility or further enhancing Ayaka's damage. For example, if you compare other options like xingqiu or ayato, they could want buffs or debuffs to enhance their own personal damage, which could end up compromising on the uptime or consistency of Ayaka's own buffs and debuffs. Just like Kokomi, many common teammates' talents, they are also casted around the character model, just like Kokomi's jellyfish. This makes teams have the ability to have great control and fluidity over your freeze AoE zones, especially with a character like Kazuha who can pull enemies towards your freeze zones. It can maintain a lot of consistency. You might not realize this sort of thing until you start playing the team, but it's very noticeable. Another common debate is comparing Kokomi or Mona in this slot. These are obviously the two most popular hydro characters for Ayaka teams, and the other options don't really match up to either of them. Obviously, the biggest advantage Kokomi has is that she is a natural healer. Technically, Mona can heal if you give a prototype Amber when you use her burst. However, the healing isn't as much as Kokomi gives, and in order to use prototype Amber, it means you can't use TTDS, which means Mona loses out on some buffs. However, if you don't care about healing, and you just want the maximum damage, in a TTDS Mona in a healerless team like this, it can have a higher damage ceiling than Kokomi. But then we have to factor other things like Mona's freeze lasting a shorter time than Kokomi's. This can be very noticeable in certain fights, for example versus these consecrated beasts, I think they're called. These guys have additional freeze resistance. I believe they get out of freeze quicker than normal enemies. So Mona having short freeze is very noticeable and it can be a lot more scuffed than using Kokomi. However, one disadvantage I would say that Kokomi has in practice is that she has longer cooldowns on her skill and therefore her freeze application than Mona does. You can defeat one set of enemies, and if another set of enemies spawn in a different part of the map, if you're using Kokomi, your jellyfish might not be off cooldown already, which means you might not be able to freeze them. Whereas with Mona, it's a lot shorter, so you can use her skill quicker. Also, technically, Kokomi's skill has a shorter animation time than Mona's setup, which uses her burst and skill. You don't always have to use Mona's burst and her skill. If you've got enough damage to meet the threshold that you need for that particular fight, you can just use Mona's skill, and then you save her burst for a different set of enemies. So overall, for most players, I would generally say that Kokomi is the best in slot hydro for this team, especially because she provides the healing, and the main real advantages that Mona has is very min-max orientated and very speedrun orientated, although you can still speedrun with Kokomi and she can sometimes be faster. Lastly, I do want to touch on burgeon teams. Unfortunately, this is the Dendro reaction that didn't really take off as well, at least in regards to Kokomi teams. I have messed around with them trying to figure out a very versatile and complete burgeon team, but unfortunately there isn't one yet. For example, here's some gameplay using Xiangling, and the main issue with this team is that it's very fragile and it's very specific. It works well in this mobbing situation. I managed to get it to work well, but it struggles outside of situations like this, especially because there's a lot of pyro application and you'll probably just be creating burning reactions and finding difficulty. Not to mention you'll probably run into energy recharge problems. If you want more controlled off-field pyro application, which can work in more situations, you can use Toma instead. Although in a situation like this, he isn't as much DPS as Xiangling, but even then, I find it still hard to recommend this team. To be honest, I'd rather replace Kokomi in these teams if I want to play a burgeon team. Burgeon teams, I find, need consistent hydro application, and although Kokomi can do that, you'd have to use sacrificial fragments if you want to reposition the jellyfish. And I think more people would just prefer playing a hyperbloom team instead. Or if you do want to play burgeon, as I said, replacing Kokomi with someone like xingqiu or doing double dendro. If you want to experiment with these teams, try figure out a team that works for you. And if someone has already figured out a team, let me know in the comments. But I would say, at least at the moment, to be honest, with Kokomi in particular, burgeon teams aren't that popular. Okay, so that was a team guide for Kokomi. Hopefully you found this video helpful. I am thinking about making some more videos this patch, like which animation combo you should be using in certain teams, and even maybe going into more detail on which artifact set you should be using in Bloom. Feel free to let me know in the comments if you had more things you would like me to cover in regards to Kokomi. Yeah, thanks for watching.